story that is true. You know, he was commander-in-chief. Not too long ago, he was at the White House in the Rose Garden talking about his grandchildren, and he slipped up on the number of them. He got confused about where they lived. And, you know, you see that in public. So you hear two different stories, and both obviously can be true. But it is a problem because what voters see is what you see in public. And what you see in public is an 80-year-old man who has a very stiff gait, you know, who speaks very, very softly. He doesn't project energy, unlike Donald Trump, who has a certain bombastic energy. And he's only 3 years younger than Biden. So what voters see is a man who is showing his age.
Right.
Doesn't help us.
Nancy, I want you to just jump in on this because you have a unique view as a foreign correspondent, someone who's traveled with presidents overseas. Those trips can be really, really tough. I mean, not only the time zone change and everything else, but unrelenting schedule. You're watching President Biden from afar on this trip, but you've seen him up close. Can you give your own assessment of how he does in these really, really difficult circumstances?
Well, I think it's fair to say that those trips are indeed grueling. We're talking about going from country to country, maybe 5 countries in 5 days. And there's been no evidence of, publicly at least, of him really struggling physically. But having said that, I think we see often events start after 10 a.m. We see different pacings of schedules than maybe some previous presidents. And so each president is allowed to set their own tone in terms of how aggressively they hold meetings, how often they hold them. But I think you see some signs of someone who might not have been moving as quickly or as Obama. But also, we haven't seen as many foreign trips, I think, by this president than some of his predecessors. And so I think there's been a real selective process in picking how they want to travel. And at the same time, signaling that the U.S. is a world leader again. So how you strike that balance of sort of meeting the needs of the president and what the physical demands of those trips, and at the same time, being able to successfully say this administration is committed to reestablishing the U.S. presence on the world stage.
Right. Frank, you've not only studied President Biden closely, but in your book, you've obviously spent a lot of time talking to Democrats about this presidency. You think in 6 or 9 months, Democrats are going to regret
this is the guy
having
listening
had a
to this
primary?
Well, I think
interview.
one reason that
Spent
Democrats
2 years
have
studying
not
Biden.
jumped to the stage question is because they like Joe Biden. Personally, they like Joe Biden. I think that he's delivered on so much of their agenda.
But a lot of Democrats, rank and file Democrats, have said they've said they see the age as a concern.
Right, and well, this is the issue: is that Biden has so struggled to sell his accomplishments, to connect with the base in any sort of meaningful way. There isn't the same sort of visceral love for Joe Biden among rank and file Democratic voters in the same sort of way that it existed maybe for Clinton and Obama. But so the question is, so the poll numbers for Biden, the recent poll numbers for Biden haven't been great. The danger is that we are sleepwalking into some sort of repeat version of the 2016 election, where Republicans have a very clear line of attack and are able to define Biden in a way that sticks not just with Republican voters, but with independents.
But there's something unreal about that, because right now the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party is facing 91 felony counts and was twice impeached. I mean, it seems almost a bit. On the one hand, you have somebody who's showing some visible signs of age, and on the other hand, you have a guy who might be a convicted felon.
I think it's incumbent. We're dealing with these split screen things where you have the Hunter Biden trial happening alongside Trump's indictments. You have questions about age being raised at the same time that you have all these questions about Donald Trump's own mental stability that perpetually are being raised. And I think it's incumbent upon media and also the Biden campaign to be able to explain the relative difference between these two things, because they simply don't exist on the same plane. Whatever Hunter Biden did is a fraction of what Donald Trump has done to democracy, or the criminal abuses that are alleged against him. Whatever his,
And noting, just, I want to hear you in 1 second, Elizabeth, on this question, but noting, this is a very important thing to say, Hunter Biden's not running for anything. Hunter Biden himself is not running for office. He's not in government, and that's one of the dissonant points here. But Elizabeth,
There's no parallel whatsoever, as Frank just said. But in those polls where people say they're concerned about the president's age, do they say they're not going to vote for him because he's old? I don't think, you can be concerned about the president's age, but you can still vote for him, especially if your choice is going to be a man facing 91 felony counts. So I think that, and also the polls it's very early. Those are head-to-head matchups of registered voters, not likely voters. We all know the caveats here.
Yeah.
It's far, they're not. Yeah, I know.
And no, I was also going to say in the economy,
It's doing super
yes.
well, but unfortunately for the Democrats in the White House, voters don't seem to know that.
well, Elizabeth, let me read you something from David Brooks just this week. Quote, Bidenomics is working big time. President Biden promised to help America outcompete authoritarian China and to heal some of the economic divides at home. Both those goals are being achieved.
Right. There-
So why can't this White House
That
get
is
that message
that is
out?
a very good question. That was an excellent column by David Brooks this morning. There was also one by Paul Krugman making the point that the economy is doing pretty well. So far there hasn't been the recession everybody was predicting, and people actually say in polls, which Krugman cites, that they're doing really well. It's just that the economy's terrible. So this makes no sense. But it seems to me that it's just odd, and I think Biden is out there talking every day about the economy, but it just doesn't seem to be sinking in at this point.
I want to turn to Biden on the global stage in 1 minute, but Frank, is there a chance that he may decide not to run?
I think that what would it take for him not to get to that point? I think there would have to be many consistent polls that showed him losing to Donald Trump by margins that are far greater than the ones that we're seeing. There would have to be pressure on him from outside. I think you've seen a lot of pressure from media this week that has kind of started to take the polling question and start to really pound Biden on this. And I think that could sink down, trickle down into a broader sense of party panic. But that's the only scenario that I could imagine where it wouldn't happen.
Right. Nancy, you study Biden on the world stage very carefully. Give us your overview. Biggest success on the world stage, biggest failure, or biggest challenge?
Well, remember when he came into the administration, he had said that he was going to be doing a couple of major things. He was going to do democracy promotion in the face. He sort of presented the world as democracies versus autocracies, and that the United States would be the face of democracy. They would go back to honoring its agreements under the Trump administration, the United States left the Iran nuclear deal. He also said that he would promote things like human rights and the environment. I think if we're picking sort of the biggest success by the own administration's measure, it would be Ukraine. This is the biggest war on Europe since 1945. I don't think at the beginning of the war that people would have anticipated that you would have a coalition that would give nearly $70 billion in military aid across Europe, that you would see a NATO alliance that's strong, even as the war has some setbacks. The willingness of the coalition to come together and make these kinds of contributions to deter these kinds of attacks on Europe, I think the administration point to as one of its great successes.
It went
In
out,
terms
it
of
went out, it
challenges,
went
I
out,
think
it
the
went
biggest
out.
one would be
Look,
Afghanistan on the
but I have your camera going.
While I think Americans supported the end of that war,
Okay, Mr. Camera.
the images of Afghans holding on to those C-17s as they took off, I think is one that will be a part of this administration's history, whatever happens on that world stage. And the fact that after 20 years, the promise of not having a country that could be a potential safe haven for terrorists, it did not pan out. You've got the Taliban back in control. They promised to. We're seeing the return of the very
Your patch looks
the
pretty
United
good.
States had targeted for 20 years, and so to me, those are, if you had to assign a biggest success, biggest failure, that's where I would put it.
Frank, you have
Looks better
in this
live.
book, you have an excellent chapter.
It does.
Chapter, a lot of coverage. Is hell bent on getting out. Can you explain that desire, and can you explain the consequences of that?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about Joe Biden is that he's somebody who's been in Washington so long, he's genuinely part of the elite, but he always thinks of himself as an outsider. And his relationship to the foreign policy elite, what Ben Rhodes termed the blob, is a very conflicted one. He wants their approval,